There are two major misconceptions you might have about Imam Ahmad Gurey or Ahmed bin Ibrahim al-Ghazi. If you don't know who Ahmed Gurey is, then probably you don't know the history of East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Ahmed Gurey could be argued to be one of the individuals who left behind the biggest impact on the history of the Horn of Africa. Actually, changed the Horn of Africa significantly. He was a leader of the Adal Sultanate, which was a very powerful commonwealth in the Horn of Africa up until could be late 16th century. And later on, we are going to look at the unique position he held in that commonwealth and how unique that commonwealth was. Now, let's look at the first misconception you might have about Ahmed Gurey, especially if you've heard history or you've read history about him or you've heard about him. You probably imagine him to be an older gentleman with probably gray beard, and you get the image of an imam, an older gentleman who, of course, seems to have lived very long. But actually, that's not what Imam Gurey was. He was an extremely young person and he died very young, actually. He was born around 1506, and by 1529, he was in charge of Adal Sultanate and he had conquered much of the Abyssinian Empire. And actually, he never lived to be an old man. He died a young man. He died at the age of 37, which is very, very young, actually. In fact, if you look across Africa today, there is hardly any leader who's below 40, and even globally, actually. So he died very young. He achieved a lot before he was 37. Before we look at the second misconception, let me talk about the book that tells his story. Of course, there are many books that have been written about Ahmed Gurey, but one that always stands out is Futu al-Habasha, which is a book that was written probably between 1543 and 1555, and it was written by a gentleman who went by the name Shihab ad-Din Abd al-Kader, or mostly is known as Arab Faqih. Now, Arab Faqih writes a very detailed, we can say, narration of what happened, how Ahmed Gurey came to power, and how he went to Abyssinia and basically conquered that land. In fact, the title itself is actually The Conquering of Abyssinia. I decided to look for this book and create an edition that I can make available to you to read. It was very difficult. Actually, the first copy I got that I was going to work with, or I worked with, is in an Arabic, but it does not have all the story. It seems like somebody was scanning the original document, which is in some archive, and he or she did a very good job up until maybe the last chapter or two chapters where probably the technology failed them and they took very terrible images that you cannot use. But then I found another copy that was made by somebody in the late 19th century, a French guy, and this gentleman did a very good job, and I decided to use that alongside the Arabic version. And if you get this book, I did include the images of the original copy of the book written in Arabic, handwritten actually. The initial parts are very clear. If you read Arabic, you can easily read it. Check the description box or the pinned comment to find the link to the book where you can get the book. Or if you are watching on TikTok, you can use, or you can check the bio. You can find the link there. Now, let's look at the second misconception you might have about Ahmed Gurey. The second misconception you might have about him, especially if you've heard stories about him, is that he came from power, that he came from maybe a very significant family. He wasn't. He didn't. In fact, he served as a horseman for the previous imam. Now, at this point, I need to describe the governance structure of the Adal Sultanate, which I find to be very interesting, actually. The Adal Sultanate was a very complex society when it came to governance. But there is something very unique about this Commonwealth, and that is power was in two centers. There were two centers of power. There was the Imam, who was more or less the high priest, and there was the Sultan, who we could say was the head of government. Now, the relationship between the two centers of power used not to be very smooth. Often they will collide for different reasons. Now, some of the people who served in the office of the Imam before Imam Gurey include Imam Mahfuz and also Imam Garad Abod. Now, Imam Garad Abod is very important in this story of Ahmed Gurey because it is him that Ahmed Gurey used to serve as a horseman. Garad Abod seems to have had, just like the other Imam, seems to have had a very difficult relationship with the reigning Sultan. And the Sultan who was reigning was one Abu Bakr. Now, Abu Bakr is described by the writer of the book Futu al-Habasha, seems to have been someone who was, we could say, less conservative and sometimes a little bit careless, because it is said that because of his ways of ruling or running the country, there used to be a lot of evil, especially robbery and corruption and things like that. People taking alcohol, which some section of the society was not very happy about, especially the very religious section of that society. So Imam Garat Abun decided he was going to, of course, confront Abu Bakr. And in that process of confronting him, he got killed. And when he got killed, his people, including Ahmed Gurey, decided to for some time to lay low. They laid low for some time, but then later on they formed an organization and then they started fighting Abu Bakr. And that conflict went on until Imam Gurey became the supreme power, actually. And then there is a description in this book on how he ended up being recognized as an imam. There are miracles that the writer describes that happened, and then the people were like, actually, this young man, even though he was very young, in his early 20s, is an imam and deserves or qualifies to serve in that office. So the point is that he did not come from power. He fought for it. He struggled. He worked through the system to acquire power. It was not given to him. That's basically the point. It was not given to him. He did not get it because he came from a certain family. He got it because he was competent. And that's very important that's an important point to make, especially when you consider how young he was. Now, after getting into power in Adal, of course, he decides to go after Abyssinia. And during this time, Adal and Abyssinia sometimes are allies. They are in friendly terms. They do commerce together. Sometimes they are enemies and they fight. Of course, Abyssinia is a Christian state and Adal is a Muslim state, and they are neighbors. And sometimes they will raid. There will be raids between the two states, and then there will be accusations. You did that to us. We are going to, of course, attack you because of that. And back and forth for the most part. And then there was a time that Abyssinia actually invaded Adal. Now, this is the time that Ahmed Gurey is about to get to power. And that made or gave Ahmed Gurey, we could say, some mileage, because now people wanted a leader, and he seemed to be the perfect leader for them. He took up the role, and then he organized Adal to go after Abyssinia. And in fact, he succeeded. By 1529, he had conquered much of Abyssinia, taken control of it. Now, it took the intervention of the Portuguese, which is another story, actually. Of course, the writer of this book does go into that to some extent. But then there is another book that I'm reading at the moment that tells the story of the conflict between Ahmed Gurey, of course, and the Portuguese, including the sons of Vasco da Gama. And that's the book titled The Portuguese Expedition to Abyssinia, 1541-1543, by Miguel del Castajoso and João Bermudez. It's a book I've gone through sometimes in the past, but I'm going to have it also available, and you can check the links, or you can check in the description box for the link to that book as well. The Portuguese Expedition tells the story from the perspective of the Portuguese. And of course, Futu Alabasha tells the story from the perspective of the Adal Sultanate. Of course, those two perspectives differ in one place or another, and it might be a good idea for you to read both to get a bigger picture of how the conflict went in that region during that time. Now, this is in the early 16th, mid 16th century, maybe beginning 1520s and ending in 1543, when Ahmed Gurey is killed by the Portuguese. Now, it is the death of Ahmed Gurey that leads to the decline of the Adal Sultanate. After his death, the army withdraws back to Adal, and then over time, that Commonwealth shrunk into being just Harar, which of course remains to be a very powerful state up to, we could say, late 19th century. Now, again, you can get this book, read it. It's a very interesting book. If you read Arabic, I've included the images of the initial copy or initial document written in Arabic, handwritten. I don't read Arabic, but I decided, let me put the images there. There are people who will prefer maybe reading the original copy in Arabic. I don't think it's actually the original copy. Maybe it's not the original copy. Could be is a copy that somebody else copied. That's also possible, of course. Those are my random thoughts.